Hi, my name is Alex Traiman. I'm coming to you live from the Jerusalem studio here at Jewish News Syndicate. I am joined by my esteemed colleague, Yaakov Lappin, who's the military affairs and strategic analyst for JNS. You can find his articles on JNS all the time. And we are here to unravel this seemingly surprise announcement that Israel was proceeding into a ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon. That agreement went into effect at 4 a.m. this morning here in Israel. There were lectures, speeches given by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the nation of Israel explaining the reasons for going into this agreement at this time. U.S. President Joe Biden gave an address from the White House explaining what he called the good news of this agreement and some of the reasons for it. And Yaakov, there really is a lot to unravel here, and I think the first thing, are the terms of the agreement. It's only in the last hour or so that I've seen the full text of the agreement posted online. It was, I think, initially posted by The National from the United Arab Emirates. Yaakov, what can you tell us about the terms of the ceasefire agreement?
So I think there are a couple of ways of approaching this. First of all, if we look at the actual agreement itself, it has two components to it. One is the formal agreement, the text that you have in front of you, and that's going to involve a 60-day gradual demilitarization process in which Hezbollah is supposed to get out of southern Lebanon. The IDF gradually withdraws, and the Lebanese armed forces, the official inept army of the state of Lebanon, is supposed to come in together with UNIFIL under the command of an enforcement mechanism, which will be overseen by an American general. And they're supposed to be the ones that will oversee this entire arrangement. Now, I'm pretty skeptical about this part of the agreement. I don't actually think that it's that important because I have no real trust in either the Lebanese armed forces, certainly not UNIFIL, and any foreigner on Lebanese soil who is not from this region, I think is not going to have a very good chance of stopping Hezbollah from entrenching itself in southern Lebanon. But my second part of the agreement, is, in my view, the much more important, and that is a side agreement between Israel and the United States, in which the United States gives Israel the acknowledgement and the legitimacy to enforce this agreement with firepower, with Israeli firepower. And this is the difference between this setup and every other past agreement that has been reached in Lebanon and failed. Israel reserves the right, and if you listen to, Israeli military leaders up and down the chain of command, they're all saying the same thing. They're saying, we intend to enforce it this time. This is the change. This is the post-October 7th change. Enforce it with fire when they detect Hezbollah trying to move into southern Lebanon, set up a new invasion force on the Lebanese-Israeli border, replenish the rocket stockpile with Iranian assistance. Those efforts, according to what I'm hearing from the defense establishment, will be bombed, will be struck. And the enforcement mechanism will be some sort of, supplementary thing for, less immediate threats. If they start digging a tunnel, then the Israel can turn to this enforcement mechanism and say, hey, we're seeing a tunnel being dug. We're monitoring the situation. You have X and X days to take care of this. And if you don't, we will.
Right.
So that's the overview of the agreement. And again, I think the most important thing is what Israel is going to do and how it's going to enforce it. That's what's going to make or break the change that we're hoping to see.
So a lot to unravel there in those statements. I have many questions on several of the different points that you raised. I think the first question that I have here is Hezbollah a party to this agreement? And I read the text of the agreement. It sounds like it's an agreement between Israel and Lebanon. But by and large, Israel was not at war with another state. It was at war with a terrorist organization within a state. So is Hezbollah a party to this agreement at all?
Alex, that's a great question because it is actually a very strange situation. We formally reached this agreement with American mediation with the state of Lebanon, but it's exactly as you say, it's actually with Hezbollah. And that's a reflection of the entire, twisted reality that we're dealing with, in which Lebanon is not a real state because the largest armed force on its soil is the Iranian-built Hezbollah Shiite terror army. they're the ones who gave the government of Lebanon their approval to sign this deal. So without Hezbollah's approval, Lebanon wouldn't have signed this agreement. And that's why it is involving Hezbollah. Basically, Hezbollah saw, and this is a good opportunity, I think, to recap, that it was hemorrhaging very seriously. Since the end of September until now, Israel has landed a series of massive blows on Hezbollah. And Hezbollah today is in many ways a shadow of its former self. More than 80% of its firepower has been destroyed. Its entire chain of command has essentially been eliminated from Nasrallah at the very top all the way down to the field commanders. And yes, it has some residual firepower, and we saw that. But really, Hezbollah today is really nothing like what it was even by mid-September. So Hezbollah had an interest in stopping this bleeding, stopping this destruction, and it went ahead and gave the Lebanese government its approval to sign this agreement because it hopes that it's going to use this time to rebuild. And that's why
when you talk about filing down 70 to 80% of Hezbollah's firepower, and the prime minister has said that in recent weeks, isn't this like putting out 70% of a wildfire, right? Like we even saw in the last moments before the ceasefire went into effect, heavy firing between Israel into southern Lebanon and even into Beirut in the last hours before the ceasefire was announced, and certainly in the last hours, days, and weeks, Hezbollah really causing significant damage to the Israeli home front, not only to the northern communities, but even in Israeli cities as far as Haifa, and certainly in closer cities like Nahariya and elsewhere. So is filing down 70 to 80% of a terrorist organization that still has the capacity to inflict serious damage, is that enough of an accomplishment?
So I think that is a very important question, and I would refer you back to what I was saying at the beginning of this conversation, which is the test is what happens now. If Hezbollah is not allowed to rebuild, and if Israel preserves the progress, and I compare it really, you probably remember in New York and in the policing world, they used to talk about the broken window policy, where if you allow one derelict building to remain in a neighborhood, that's going to drag everything downhill very quickly. And I think this is the philosophy now that needs to guide and will decide whether this is going to be a wildfire that will return, or whether we're going to control the flames and keep dousing them. You heard about, expressions like mowing the lawn. Again, if Israel enforces this agreement and takes firepower action on every violation that it recognizes, then I think that this will be a net gain for Israeli security, because we will not have an invasion force, an Iranian-backed genocidal invasion force, and the rocket stockpile. Let's talk about that for a second. So I remember, attending a lot of briefings in the years that led up to this war, and all the briefings that I attended talked about really some horrible scenarios regarding what Hezbollah could do to the Israeli home front. And, we were hearing stuff like over 10,000 projectiles. I'm including mortars in that, by the way. They could be rained down on the Israeli home front, 4,000 to 5,000 rockets a day in the opening, week to 10 days, things that we have never experienced in the state of Israel. And, even more than 1,000 rockets on central Israel. And today, the worst, and I'm not, making light of it, it is a serious threat, especially to the north, is about 200 to 250 rockets. That's Hezbollah's biggest effort. So we're talking about like a percent to 2% of the original arsenal that Hezbollah could, bring to bear in terms of activating it. So they've lost 80%, but they're not even able to activate in a major way their remaining firepower, because their chain of command is shot. Their commanders, were eliminated up and down the chain of command of Hezbollah's operational structure. It began with the beeper attacks. It went on with these massive airstrikes, then the ground forces. It just absorbed one hammer blow after another. So to answer your question, I think that it's about enforcement and preservation. And I look at the sort of broken window philosophy. I think if Israel does apply this, even at the cost of letting go of the ceasefire and returning to an escalation, because Israel has realized that it cannot let cancerous tumors, to use an analogy, grow on its borders. If this internalization has occurred, then I think that Israel's strategic situation will really, really improve when it comes to Lebanon. and to the point where Israel will not have to take Hezbollah into account when it thinks about the next big challenge, which is the Iranian nuclear program. And I actually think that we're already there. We don't really have to think about Hezbollah when we talk about dealing with the Iranian nuclear program.
Before we get to Iran, and I do want to get to that, it's an important point, but I still want to focus here on the Lebanon Hezbollah conflict here. What about the timing, right? If Israel was continuing to do significant damage, and even in the last days, Israel continued to take out top Hezbollah operatives and remove some of this capabilities, it was clear that Israel could have kept going and could have kept taking out more of Hezbollah capabilities. Why declare the ceasefire now as opposed to in 2 weeks from now? Fine, Hezbollah wants a ceasefire because they're getting pummeled even while they're still able to do damage. But why does Israel give Hezbollah the opportunity on its terms to decide when there will be a ceasefire? What happened now that makes it a reason for Israel to enter into this agreement?
So I think there were a couple of factors that influenced Prime Minister Netanyahu and the cabinet in going for it now. And there were some hints about this as well in Netanyahu's speech last night. I think, first of all, they want to clear a table, so to speak, and focus on what I just said earlier, the Iranian threat. So if the Air Force no longer has to, conduct massive strikes across Lebanon, that frees it up for planning and implementation potentially for the next phase of the state-on-state conflict with Iran. Second of all, this also frees up a lot of reservists. And that means that the regular IDF can be the main force that deals with the Gaza Strip. So Israel can go back to prioritizing and finish what it started in Gaza, because the IDF won't be split between two active war fronts anymore, assuming the ceasefire holds, of course. And, we hope that it will, but we don't know. And so you have this sort of arena prioritization where the ground forces can go to Gaza, reservists are released, and there was a sort of sense of diminishing returns. So if 80% of Hezbollah's firepower has been destroyed, its leadership has been eliminated, and sure, the operation could have been expanded. It could have gone beyond the Litani. The IDF could have done it, but I think there was a sense that there was a diminishing return on that effort. And what they wanted to do was to press freeze on the northern arena, finish the war effort in Gaza. And by the way, that includes the need to deal with Hamas as a political regime that's trying to come back, and the Iranian arena. And another thing that we seem to have heard in recent days is that this will also help ensure that bombs arrive from the United States with held weapons. And that's going to be potentially very relevant for continued war efforts.
I want to talk about this point, if you can, about the weapons. And this has kind of been the elephant in the room. It's been alluded to by Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's been denied by members of the Biden administration. It has been alleged by Republican senators that there is this problem of supply of weapons from the United States to Israel. What is the IDF saying about this? What do we know? What's the state of the quantity of weapons, munitions that Israel has? What is it waiting for? And how did that factor into the timing of the decision to enter the ceasefire?
So the official, sort of Biden administration story here is that they're only withholding one shipment of heavy bombs because they were concerned that Israel would, quote unquote, misuse it in the Gaza Strip, which in and of itself is, I think, an appalling act for an ally to do to another ally. But let's set that aside for a second. That's their official story. But there are plenty of very credible reports saying that it's not just one shipment. There are other shipments that haven't been officially withheld. They're sort of being slow walked. We can talk about a slowing down of the delivery process. And that, appears to include tank shells and missiles that can be fired from the air. There's a whole host of munitions. Now, Israel has also begun to produce, to a very significant degree, some of these things locally. And obviously, it's going to be much more expensive when Israel is the one that's building it and not using American aid assistance to purchase these arms. But that has happened because one of the big realizations, I think, of this war is that, the weapons stockpile that Israel had in place going forward was far too small. and B, exclusively relying on the United States for critical weapon supplies has been a huge mistake, because it just gives the United States so much freedom, to extort the Israeli government. I can't think of another way to put it. And I don't think Israel can ever again take that kind of risk. Now, we also have to say that, the Biden administration did supply, many cargo planes of weapons at the beginning of this war, and over, $17 billion of assistance was passed. So of course that happened. But the way that this issue has been used to try and influence and extort the Israeli government, I think, is a red warning sign. And I really hope, and I'm hearing, good things from the defense ministry here about this, that there really has been this realization. We can't put all our eggs in one basket. We don't know which government's going to be in power at any certain year. There has to be a degree of independence. And it's not just about making it here, by the way. It's also about diversifying imports. I think that's another thing to look at. So these are all things that are happening all at the same time. But I think that this was one of the factors that helped influence the decision. By no means the only one or the decisive one, but I think it was something that helped push the cabinet in that direction. When you link it up to Iran, especially Iran seems to play a very big role in this decision, and kind of freeing the Air Force up for whatever potential missions it might get next.
Let's talk a little bit, even before we get to Iran, about the mechanics now of the ceasefire. There's different reports, and I think people are interpreting this differently about whether this 60-day period that's being discussed. First of all, I saw Mike Johnson put out a tweet calling this a 60-day ceasefire, right? And initial reports were that this could be a 60-day ceasefire. President Biden said last night in his speech that this is a permanent ceasefire agreement. But there does seem to be a mechanism here where the IDF will withdraw from southern Lebanon over a period of 60 days. Now, if the IDF is inside southern Lebanon for the next 2 months, is that still a ceasefire? And what are the rules of engagement for the IDF over these next 60 days? Is this a situation that now becomes much more dangerous for IDF troops that are stationed inside Lebanon over the next 60 days? And in addition to that, we were continuing to get reports from soldiers that were operating in Lebanon that they were going in and out of Lebanon on a regular basis. So does that mean that the IDF can still enter and exit southern Lebanon over the next 60 days? And what is it doing there over the next 60 days?
So they're talking about like a phase reduction, but what that means essentially is that for the next 60 days, the IDF, according to this framework, is going to remain in Lebanon, gradually starts drawing down if this ceasefire is kept. But at the same time, it's going to monitor the situation very closely. So the units that are there, for example, today, have, instead of going on, seek and destroy missions, are now on patrol. And you have basically the intelligence apparatus and the Air Force conducting patrols, reconnaissance. They are looking for violations. We've already had a number of incidents, vehicles containing Hezbollah suspects that were fired upon and turning back. And so this is all about right now testing the waters to see if this thing even holds in the first few days, to try and see if it stabilizes, because we don't know whether it will or won't, and nobody does. So my assumption is that Hezbollah is going to try and challenge every step of this ceasefire arrangement and see how far it can get away with doing that. And it's going to be up to Israeli decision makers to make it clear that they are willing to, I think this is the irony, the best way of stabilizing the ceasefire is to make it clear to Hezbollah that Israel is willing to give up the ceasefire in order to enforce the ceasefire. If you get the thing, yeah.
Now, the Lebanese army is supposed to be the one that enforces that Hezbollah doesn't build up in southern Lebanon. According to the text of the agreement, the Lebanese army is even supposed to be dismantling Hezbollah infrastructure that they find. What's the difference between the Lebanese military and Hezbollah? Is it possible for Hezbollah to have infiltrated into the Lebanese army? Is it possible for Hezbollah terrorists to be dressed in the uniforms of the Lebanese army? And doesn't this make the situation much more dangerous? Because until this ceasefire was signed, the Lebanese army was not operating in southern Lebanon, meaning that the IDF had much more freedom of action. And now you have this other fighting force that's there coming in over the next 60 days. The text of the agreement doesn't really seem to indicate, what the phased drawdown of the IDF is or the phased entry of the Lebanese military looks like. So break this down now for us regarding the Lebanese army.
So the Lebanese armed forces, the Lebanese army, have already been infiltrated by Hezbollah. This is something that's been going on for years. Part of this is a reflection of the changing demographic balance of Lebanese society. As the Shiite sect grew, more and more Shiite officers rose to the ranks of the Lebanese army, and those are the people that have links very organically with their community, and their community is the community that's the base of Hezbollah. So Hezbollah not only infiltrated the Lebanese army, but I personally saw with my own eyes joint patrols in past years between Hezbollah and Lebanese armed forces representatives. I saw them sitting together in those towers that they built on the border before the IDF knocked them down. So they cooperated. The Lebanese army has been infiltrated by Hezbollah. And as I said, earlier, I have no faith at all in the Lebanese army. I think that it's kind of a cosmetic sort of thing that has been, appendixed onto this agreement to try and, convince whoever might want convincing that this has a chance of reestablishing Lebanese sovereignty. This is the thing that the West and the Biden administration in France have been pushing for, this idea that here's a chance to change the domestic situation in Lebanon. Hezbollah has been weakened. That's true militarily. It's much weaker. So they're hoping that the Lebanese state will be able to fill in the blanks. Now, again, if the agreement was just based on the Lebanese army, I would be extremely pessimistic about its chances of success. I would give it actually zero, really, just, based on, 30 years of past experience. But because the IDF and the Israeli government have officially taken it upon themselves to be the final enforcement mechanism, I think that it's less important what the Lebanese army does. I have no faith in them. Will they become a complicating factor? Possibly they might, just as UNIFIL was used as human shields by Hezbollah throughout this entire war. They were used actively as human shields. We might see a repeat of that. I'm not ruling that out, but I trust the IDF's capabilities to use their very precise firepower when necessary to deal with that. And we're not starting from scratch, right? We're not starting on a battlefield where Hezbollah saturates southern Lebanon. Just to clarify the current situation, the whole line of southern Shiite villages that were used as invasion bases has been cleared by the IDF. The second line of villages has been cleared. And now the IDF is going to start scrutinizing who can and cannot come back. So there's a head start here for the IDF. It's going to be easier. It's still very challenging, but we're going to see a lot of intelligence monitoring from the air, from the ground, and filtering and screening who's coming in. It will be a complex situation, but I think that the IDF is more than up to the job, and it's able to, direct its firepower when necessary and enforce this thing. And the Lebanese army, I think, is not going to be a very important player here at all.
Now, the United States and France are supposed to provide some kind of supervisory mechanism here to be on top, in a sense of UNIFIL, to be a place to be reporting violations. UNIFIL also plays an important role here, according to the text of the agreement. Like, violations are supposed to come to the UN Security Council as well. Can you talk a little bit about how Israel could even think about relying on UNIFIL or the UN Security Council to be involved in this, and what does the presence in this agreement of the United States and France actually do for Israel?
So again, I don't think that any of this is going to be very, let's say, influential in the post-war arrangement. I see these all as kind of, wishful thinking attempts by France, by the United States, to try and give this arrangement a degree of legitimacy for the Lebanese state. And they're saying, look, it's not just the Lebanese state. We've got, the American military involved. We've got UNIFIL. We all know what that's worth. I don't know if our readers even need reminders or viewers of how utterly useless UNIFIL has been over the past 20 years in southern Lebanon, with Hezbollah literally, setting up positions under their nose, digging tunnels and using them as human shields. completely useless. And the UN Security Council, with Russia and China have automatic vetoes there. So what's that going to do? I base all of my hopes here on the IDF and what I call enforcement through fire. Enforcement through fire is the thing that's going to make a difference. And all of the formal clauses of this agreement, this is just my interpretation, all the things we're talking about, Lebanese army, UNIFIL, the enforcement mechanism, I think are going to play a very peripheral role because I don't think that they have the ability on their own to stop Hezbollah's infiltration efforts. And we've seen this before. We've been through this movie. We know that only only the IDF with its intelligence and its firepower can stop Hezbollah from moving back into southern Lebanon. Now that really, I think,
the IDF is really it's a people's army, right? Most of the troops are reserves. Even though you do have a professional army, it's conscripted. People have to serve in the army. And we've seen as the war has progressed, both in the Gaza front as well as in the southern Lebanon front, that sometimes there is a difference of views about how the war should be carried out between the soldiers that are fighting there, saying, just give us the green light, let us go take care of the enemies, give us the support we need, we're willing to do the job, versus some of the upper echelons, which come from what's called in Israel this conceptio class, this older thinking, which has led to agreements like the UN Resolution 1701, which was signed in 2006 to put UNIFIL in place after the last Israel-Lebanon conflict. And so you might have this difference here between the way some of the soldiers feel about this agreement and the way some of the senior leaders of the military and also the political establishment look at this agreement. What are you hearing regarding that?
So first of all, just to say what I think should happen is I think in a democracy, the government is supposed to give the orders to the military, and whatever the military upper echelon senior brass may think, they're supposed to carry out those orders. They can recommend whatever they like, but when the order is given, they have to give the order. They have to implement the order, and that goes the same for the field, level as well. That's what an organized democratic military force should look like, and does look like, thankfully, in the state of Israel. Even though we have seen, especially in Gaza, lots and lots of pushback and friction on policy, but that's a separate topic. Look, from the field, I think that there are voices saying we should continue fighting, we should move up to the Litani River, and everybody, looks at their own picture. So a field commander, I think that's his job. He should want to continue fighting. We want field commanders to say that. Those are the right people, in the right place. They're supposed to be, a driving force that always wants to engage the enemy, destroy the enemy. That is their job title. And if that's their attitude, then that means all is well at the field command level. The senior military leadership, I'm not actually sure what its preference would have been regarding this stage of the war. I'm not entirely sure about that, but what I'm hearing, at least, from briefings and from security officials now, is that they very much, let's say, believe in their ability to do what the government has told them to do, which is to enforce this agreement. They certainly believe that they can do it. I feel that they want to do it. And that's actually very refreshing to me. That's something that I have been looking out for a lot recently, because as part of the lessons of the 7th, I think the most fundamental lesson of the October 7th massacre is that we cannot allow terrorist armies to grow unchecked on our borders ever again. Not in Lebanon, not in Gaza, not in Judea and Samaria, not anywhere. And so I'm always looking out for signs, to see whether that lesson has been internalized. And the good news is, at least as far as I can tell, is that I'm hearing good things when it comes to dedication and commitment to implementing that. And I see that there is an alignment here between the government and the military regarding the desire and the belief that Israel can preserve its achievements in Lebanon and is not intending to go back in time to, containment, to when we saw tents being built in Israeli territory, which was, you remember that whole episode with the tent that Hezbollah built in northern Israel, but that was just symbolic of a much larger, monstrous threat that was just built unchecked throughout Lebanon, from the very border villages and all the way up to Beirut and the Bekaa Valley. So That's the determination that I'm hearing, and there is alignment about that, and long may that continue, because I think that's the guarantee for our future security and survival in this region.
Now, let's talk about Gaza for a moment. The prime minister did say in his reasoning for entering into this agreement that this would isolate Hamas. And you alluded to the fact also that Israel may now want to put more of its force and attention into, let's say, cleaning up in Gaza and moving on from Hamas, meaning like removing them from a place of control, let's say, over the humanitarian aid distribution and political control in Gaza. Tell me, why is it important to isolate Hamas? In a way, tying it together with the Lebanese front has made this more of a war between Israel and Iran and its proxies, as opposed to, as part of this intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I think has been helpful in a sense for the diplomatic war and the battle of public opinion that Israel's facing. But now we're going to move back potentially into this smaller front, which is Gaza, which is against Hamas. Hezbollah is now presumably out of the picture if the ceasefire holds. What does this mean for the IDF? And specifically, I think the issue on everybody's minds is, can a ceasefire be entered into with Hamas, and specifically a ceasefire that would lead to the return of the Israeli hostages that are still inside Gaza?
Right. And I view, Hamas in the same way that I view Hezbollah in this framework, which is an Iranian proxy terror force, which would not have existed in its current form without having joined the Iranian axis. Hamas was another component of the Iranian Ring of Fire unification of fronts vision, which was pioneered by Qasem Soleimani, the former commander of the Quds Force, who was killed by the U.S. in 2020 in Baghdad. They were all part of the same, Iranian strategy of surrounding Israel with a ring of fire and leading to its collapse. And this is a strategy that has failed. So I view Hamas as an intrinsic part of that. And the fact that Iran has lost Hamas as a regional proxy is very good news for us. And so regarding, where this leaves Hamas, I think it does leave it far more isolated, because when the Hamas terrorists in the Gaza Strip saw that the IDF had to balance out the needs of the Gazan front with the Lebanese front, that gave them hope. That gave them the idea that they could stretch this out, that they could continue fighting and wear Israel down. Because we're not an army that's the size of the U.S. Military. We don't have 1 million soldiers and endless fighting personnel. We're a country of 10 million people. And there's a limit to how much military resources, especially reservists, we can, invest in multiple active fronts. So I think Hamas was gambling on wearing us down. And when they see that Hezbollah has been forced to exit this conflict, and that Hezbollah's long-standing claim that it would only cease its fire once a truce, which is another way of saying that it would only cease its fire once it saw that Hamas would be saved, because that's why Hamas wants a truce. It wants to save itself so that it can retake the Gaza Strip. That's their entire goal, and that's why they're holding the hostages. So once Hamas sees that Israel has settled that front without giving in to all of Hamas's demands, that's going to seriously demoralize, in my view, the terrorists that remain in Gaza Strip, as well as Hamas's overseas leadership, and it will force them to rethink, hopefully, their position regarding what they're demanding from Israel. So that may open up the door to renewed negotiations in which Hamas drops some of their maximalist demands. Until now, they've been demanding the same thing, which is that Israel just leave the Gaza Strip, basically for good, in order to get the hostages to facilitate a deal. And this would, of course, result in Hamas retaking the Gaza Strip. That's the whole, thinking behind their hostage maximalist position. So Hamas may now feel that they can no longer hold on to that position, and they may lower their threshold for a deal. If that happens, that would be good news. I think that, most people in Israel would favor some sort of temporary ceasefire to facilitate a hostage deal on the very clear understanding that as soon as that ceasefire is over, the IDF has got to go back into Gaza, because if it leaves now, I think that we're going to lose all of our achievements in the Gaza Strip, and that would be a disaster, I think, for the security of 10 million people in this country. So Hopefully, the isolation of Hamas and the fact that the IDF is now going to bring more resources to this front will weaken their position. And also, I think, more strategically speaking, it will enable Israel to do what I think it has to do, which is, I call this regime change. Israel has got to follow through on regime change in the Gaza Strip. And that means, as you alluded to in your question, making sure that Hamas can't hijack and distribute aid, making it clear to everybody, to Gazans in the entire region, that Hamas, even as a political force, is finished in the Gaza Strip. It's not coming back. In the same way that Germany was denazified, Gaza has got to be de-Hamasified. And that's going to require a lot of resources, commitment, and abandoning this sort of in and out logic where, the IDF goes in and then comes back out and Hamas fills that vacuum. That pattern has got to be broken. And now with the northern front hopefully stabilized, we have a good chance of accomplishing that on the southern front.
Well, let's turn it now towards the head of the terror octopus, which is Iran. Prime Minister Netanyahu said the first reason for declaring the ceasefire now was to turn the attention of the IDF toward Iran, but then said explicitly that he cannot elaborate on what that means. What can we guess that could mean, and what's the IDF preparing? And then the other thing which I think is important to note is this sort of 60-day withdrawal period. And at the end of that 60-day withdrawal period from southern Lebanon, there's going to be a new U.S. administration in office. So is the timing of that withdrawal period related to what Netanyahu said about Iran? What do you think Israel could be planning in the days ahead with regard to Iran?
So when we talk about Iran in the days ahead, just to clarify and issue some sort of disclaimer, because, obviously it's sensitive, but I'm just going to say that everything I'm saying here is purely based on my own assessment and not based on any conversations with any security officials, because, it really isn't when it comes to Iran. These are purely my own assessments. But judging by the public speeches of Prime Minister Netanyahu, it is clear to me that he wants to now prioritize the need to deal with Iran's nuclear program. Iran's nuclear program is the biggest current threat to our existence. And just to quickly recap, for everybody, the Iranian strategy that was designed to lead to our destruction was based on three components. One was the proxy, what they call the Axis regional terror armies, the Ring of Fire. That has largely failed. The second was the missiles and the UAVs that Iran built up on its own soil. And because of, the ingenuity of Israeli air defenses, as well as the two recent airstrikes that occurred in Iran, and talk a little bit about that, what they achieved, that component has largely been defanged. It's still a threat, but far less than what it was, let's say, several months ago. And the third component is the nuclear program. The nuclear program is designed to provide a nuclear umbrella over the regime and its entire proxy network. And so what's left of this strategy essentially is the nuclear program, and A is the most advanced that it's ever been. They're between 6 months to a year and a half from the ability to actually build a nuclear device, and they're weeks away from having enough uranium to produce several atomic devices. Those are two parallel processes. They're not the same, but they're all linked. And the bottom line is that they're far too close, and they're very, very close. So I think that when you listen to Netanyahu's speeches, it's clear to me that he wants to prioritize this now. And we can even ask why on October 26th, when the Israeli Air Force took control of Iranian skies and destroyed most of Iran's air defenses and missile production sites and a single nuclear site, why didn't we go after the nuclear sites? So it seems to me that attack on October 26th actually laid the groundwork for the next step. Because right now, if we link everything he said together, and look at this sort of as a grand, chess board, Iran, its first point of deterrence against us was Hezbollah and its massive firepower. That's largely off the table. The second thing that they wanted to use to deter Israel from hitting its nuclear program was its missile program. That has been seriously reduced as a threat. And so basically the Iranian nuclear sites right now are defenseless. They are defenseless. And so there is a really, major opportunity to take action against that. Now, when you add the arrival of the Trump administration, which, assuming that it's not going to, try to go for some sort of diplomatic solution with Iran, assuming it's going to give Israel the green light and the backing, at least the diplomatic backing and perhaps some military backing, then there is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here to go after the Iranian nuclear program. And it seems to have all, been building up for this. And that's why, with the Air Force less busy in Lebanon, the ground forces are going more to Gaza. And by the way, the ground forces situation is not relevant to Iran. When we're talking about Iran, it's Air Force and intelligence. Those are the two components that we would need to deal with the Iranian nuclear program. But both of those will be a lot freer now. So it looks like it's heading in that direction. Obviously, we don't know, but it seems that it's heading in that direction. The only thing that I could see that would prevent this from happening is some sort of unlikely, if the Iranians connect the dots in the same way that I just did, maybe they'll try to make an offer and say, hey, we're willing to, enter a new deal and take apart our own nuclear infrastructure, which they've done to certain degrees in the past. And my hope is that we don't fall for that because it's deceptive. And that nuclear program needs to be rolled back. So I think that's kind of where we're at when we're looking at it from a grand macro perspective.
And I think the question has always been with regard to Iran and the nuclear program, does Israel have the military capabilities to take out these Iranian nuclear sites, which are located all across the Iranian country? And it's a big country, and many of them are deep underground, under mountains even. There's always been the question about Israel's bunker busting technology versus what the United States obviously has. Can Israel do this on its own if it gets a green light from the United States to do that? Or even if it doesn't get a green light, can Israel do that?
So I think that Israel has the ability to strike the Iranian nuclear program. I'm not confident that we can destroy it in the same way that, let's say, the American Air Force can destroy the nuclear sites. But I think Israel can cause serious damage to multiple core nuclear sites in a way that would set the program back by years, right? And I always look at the Iranian nuclear program as a sort of stop clock, which is basically competing with a second stop clock, which is when will the Iranian regime fall? When will it collapse? When will the Iranian people rise up against it? And when you look at the Iranian regime stop clock, we don't know when that's going to hit zero. It's impossible to predict. It's not a science. It could happen suddenly. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen in 5 years. It's just one big unknown. But we do know where the Iranian nuclear stop clock is, and it's far too close to zero. And so I think that our goal in Israel should be to set the clock back and to give enough time for the other clock to tick down. And if necessary, to just keep doing that, because I think that's the best shot that we have for avoiding nightmare scenarios of a nuclear-armed Islamic Republic. So I think that the Israeli Air Force, look, in the year 2022, 2 years ago, the Israeli Air Force prioritized readiness for the mission of harming the Iranian nuclear program as its top priority. This involves getting the right ammunition, getting new kinds of intelligence, refuelers. You don't need B-52 bombers to launch this attack. You can do it with the current fleet of fighter jets. There are all kinds of tactics and ways to do this. And Israel has already proven that not only can it cover this distance, but it can, really just become the air dominant, implement its air superiority over Iranian air defenses and drop munitions at will. And so, Iran finds itself in the position where every munition that Israel is going to fire going forward at its targets will reach the target, whereas the majority of what Iran will fire back at Israel will be intercepted by air defenses. That's an inferior position to be in. It's not where they want it to be. So we really have a chance here. And yes, the Israeli Air Force can hit the nuclear program. I'm not talking about permanent destruction of the program. The Iranians would be able to rebuild. But if it's set back by a number of years, I think that would be a very important achievement for our continuity here.
Well, we're just about running out of time. But I wanted to give you the last word, maybe in less than 1 minute. Is this war over? Is it coming to an end? Are we just now getting to a new phase?
So, when it comes to jihadists, I personally don't believe that there's any such thing as an end. I just think, as you've just said, that there are phases, because the jihadists, in their minds, the war against us and our state is eternal. And it's going to continue in our generation and very likely in the next generation as well. And I say that to people as well. I say, don't dream about an end to the conflict, because I don't think that that's realistic. But if we manage the conflict from a situation of strength, and if we now don't allow the threats to become monstrous again, then I think we have a very good chance of moving to the next phase and basically managing our security threats and reshaping the region to our benefit in a much, much better manner than we have in recent years. So the war will likely be downgraded to a conflict. The conflict is not over. I believe that it's going to be a multi-generational conflict until the jihadist ideology will lose all credibility in the Muslim world. And I don't think that that's going to happen in our generation's lifetime. But the thing I'm looking at is capabilities. They must never again have an army on our border. They must never again be able to flood our skies with projectiles. We've got to make sure that their capabilities are always being mowed down. And if those are the conditions, then I think that our continuity here will be assured. So that's the way I look at it. The war might be over, but the conflict is going nowhere.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. Incredible insights from Yaakov Lappin, our military and strategic affairs analyst at JNS. This is the type of analysis and information that we at JNS are providing on the daily basis on our website, jns.org, in our daily newsletter that's going out to hundreds of thousands of people. You can sign up for that at jns.org as well. If you like this video, subscribe to this channel, click on the super thanks. You can support us that way as well. And thank you, Yaakov, for what you've provided here today. And we will look forward to bringing additional updates as more major developments take place. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. Always a pleasure.